Wyoming Territory, 1881. The wind carried dust and silence through the town of Three Cedars when Florence Whitlow stepped off the stagecoach, her hands clenched tight around the small traveling bag that held everything she had left. She did not look around. She did not smile. She only stepped down, her boots hitting the dirt like a final sentence. The wide brim of her black hat shaded her eyes, but nothing could hide the hollowness in them. She had not smiled in nearly 3 years, not since her baby boy, Oliver, was buried under the elm tree back in Missouri. A fever had taken him before he turned 2. After that, her husband had taken to whiskey, then to silence, and finally to a bullet in the barn. Florence had answered the mail-order bride ad 2 months later. Not for love. Not even for companionship. Just distance. Just a place where no one knew her son's name or the sound of his laugh. A tall man stood a few feet away from the coach, hat in hand, linen shirt tugged into worn trousers, leather suspenders stretching across broad shoulders. His boots were dusty, but his posture was clean and sure. He looked younger than she expected, maybe 30, but there was something steady in his eyes, something that did not flinch when he saw her. He did not smile either. "Florence," he asked. She nodded once. "I'm Marston Reddick," he said. "I sent the letter." "I know. I got the wagon hitched around back," he said. "You need a minute?" "No," he led her around the side of the depot, a quiet kind of man, not pushy. The wagon was simple, with a single bench and a few sacks of grain in the back. Florence climbed up without help, settled her bag between her boots, and folded her hands in her lap. Marston waited until the horses were moving before he asked, "You ever been out this way before?" "No, drier than Missouri, but the views make up for it." She kept looking forward. They rode in silence for a while, the town falling away behind them, the hills flattening into open land. The Reddick homestead sat on a low rise, a 2-room cabin with a barn just beyond and a chicken coop farther still. A soft line of smoke rose from the chimney. "It ain't much," Marston said as he stopped the wagon. "It's fine." She stepped down before he could offer a hand. The wind tugged at her skirts as she walked toward the porch. The house smelled like pine and soap. It was clean, not fancy. A patchwork quilt lay folded over the bed. There was a braided rug on the floor and a kettle warming by the stove. "I cleared out the second room for you," Marston said, setting her bag down near the door. "Figure will take some time. No rush to anything." Florence's throat tightened, but she said nothing. She went into the small room, sat on the edge of the bed, and stared at the wall. That night, she listened to the wind rattle the window and kept her arms folded tight across her stomach, the way she used to hold Oliver when his fever kept him shaking. The next morning, she found Marston already outside, feeding the hens. He looked up when he heard her steps and tipped his hat. "Coffee's on the stove," he said. She nodded and went inside. The days passed quiet. Florence kept to herself, cleaned what did not need cleaning, and cooked meals she barely tasted. Marston never pressed her, never asked about the sadness that clung to her like a second skin. He worked the land, fixed the fences, and came home dusty and tired. But he always took his boots off at the door, always said thank you after supper, always made sure the lantern was filled and the firewood stacked. One afternoon, she found him down by the creek, his sleeves rolled up, patching the broken edge of the small footbridge. "You need help?" she asked, surprising herself. He looked up, surprised too, but not startled.
"Sure."
"You ever hold nails?" She knelt beside him, held the wooden beams steady while he hammered. His hands were rough, but his voice was soft when he talked her through it. "Did you build this?" she asked. "My pa did. I was 14. He made me carry every beam. Swore it would teach me something." "Did it?" "I guess so. I remember how it felt to finish it. That was something." They were quiet a moment. "Oliver liked creeks," she said suddenly, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. We used to sit by the one behind her house. He liked to throw rocks in. Marston did not say anything. He just nodded and kept hammering. That night, she cried into her pillow for the first time in over a year. A week later, she found a small bundle on the table, 3 paper-wrapped books. When she opened the first, her fingers shook. "How did you know I like stories?" she asked, holding up the worn copy of Jane Eyre. "You mentioned it in your letter," Marston said. "Said you used to read before." "Everything." "I did. They were selling books in town. Thought maybe they'd help pass the time." Florence stared at him. "Why are you kind to me?" He shrugged, looking down. "You looked like you needed someone to be." Her breath caught in her chest. She walked out then, not because she was angry, but because her heart felt too full and too broken at the same time. One morning, she caught him staring at her while she hung laundry. "What?" she asked, her tone sharp. He shook his head. "Just. You looked different." "Different how?" "Like you were here, not somewhere else." Florence looked down at the sheet in her hands. Her heart beat faster, but not in fear. "I'm trying," she said. "That's enough," he said. She looked up at him, and for the first time since Missouri, her lips twitched at the corners. Not a full smile, but something close. Later that week, a storm rolled in fast. Thunder cracked over the hills, and wind tore through the trees. The roof of the barn threatened to lift. Marston ran out to secure it, and Florence followed without thinking. "You should stay inside," he yelled over the wind. "So should you." They fought the wind together, tying down the tarp, checking the animals. Mud soaked her skirts, and her hair stuck to her face, but she did not care. When it finally passed, they were both soaked and laughing. It was the first time Florence laughed since her son died. Marston stared at her, stunned. "Well, I'll be." She wiped at her face. "Do not get used to it." He held her gaze. "I would not mind if I did." Her breath caught again, but this time it did not hurt. That night, she stood in the doorway of the living room while he read by the fire. "Marston." He looked up. "I do not know what you expect from me," she said, voice steady. "But I am not the woman I used to be. I am not soft. I am not cheerful. I may never be." He stood, set the book aside. "I do not need cheerful. I just want real. I am still broken. So am I in my own way." She stepped closer. "I do not know how to start again." "You already have," he said. "You just did not notice." She looked at him, and something inside her shifted. Quiet, but real. "Do you want a life with me?" she asked. His voice was sure. "Yes, Florence."
I do.
She nodded once and reached for his hand. And for the first time in years, she smiled. The wind had stilled, but the earth stayed damp for days after the storm. Florence knelt in the garden plot behind the cabin, pressing her fingers into the darkened soil. She'd cleared the weeds herself, rows straight as stitches, and now she held a small sack of seeds in her lap: beans, squash, and carrots, all saved from the last harvest. She'd found them in a tin box inside the barn, labeled in Marston's careful script. "Most folks wait for late April," came his voice from behind her, "but I figure you're not most folks." She didn't turn but let the seeds fall one by one into the furrows she'd dug. "I need something to look forward to," she said. He came closer, crouching after a moment beside her, his knees creaking against the soil. "They'll come up strong. This land's quiet, but it holds on." She glanced at him. "Like you." "I reckon," he said, and drew a line in the dirt with his thumb. She watched his hand. How sure it was, how steady. "You always know what to say?"
No.
"I just say what's true." They planted in silence after that, working side by side until the sun dropped low and the air turned cool again. That evening, Florence sat at the table sewing a tear in the shoulder of Marston's shirt. He leaned against the doorframe, watching the last light fade out across the hills. "I got word from my sister," he said. She's coming through from Evanston next week. Wants to stop in. She close with you? Florence asked, tying off the thread. He nodded once. She raised me after our ma passed. She's sharp. Keeps her thoughts sharp, too. Florence folded the shirt neatly. Will she like me? Marston turned to face her fully. She'll see what I see. Florence lowered her eyes. And what's that? A woman made of more than just sorrow. Florence swallowed, the needle still warm in her fingers. I don't know if I believe that yet. You don't have to, he said. I'll believe it enough for both of us. She set the shirt aside and stood, brushing her palms together. Do you have anything of hers in the house? A quilt she made, bottom drawer. And a Bible with her name in it, on the shelf near the stove. Florence moved to the shelf and ran her fingers along the spine of the old book. She must have loved you something fierce. She still does. She'll bring pie. She always does. Florence let a small sound pass her lips, not quite a laugh, but close. If she brings apple, I might believe everything you've told me. Marston smiled quietly and reached for the lamp, turning the wick down. They didn't speak again that night, but the stillness between them felt different, now less like absence, more like promise. 3 days later, the dirt road shimmered under the spring sun, and Marston's sister arrived in a borrowed buggy, her bonnet tied tight, and her hands firm on the reins. She stepped down without waiting for help and swept dust from her skirts with a practiced flick. You must be Florence, she said, her voice brisk but not unkind. Florence nodded. And you're Maribel. And yes, I brought pie. Florence blinked, then let out a breath that almost passed for a laugh. That evening, after supper, Maribel spread her embroidery on the table while Marston cleaned the dishes. Florence watched her, fascinated by the way the woman's fingers moved, quick and precise, never wasting a stitch. You sew like it's a race, Florence said. Maribel didn't look up. Life's short. I never saw the point of dawdling. Florence glanced toward the stove. I used to sew little shirts. For my son. Maribel didn't flinch, just nodded once. I'm sorry for your loss. Thank you. There was a long pause before Maribel spoke again. If you stay, I'll teach you the herringbone stitch. It holds better than the rest. Florence met her gaze. I plan on staying. Good. Maribel went back to her embroidery. He's steadier when someone's beside him. Florence watched her needle rise and fall. So am I. Marston didn't say anything, but Florence saw the way his shoulders eased. Later that night, after Maribel had gone to bed in the guest cot and the fire had burned low, Florence stepped outside into the hush of crickets and cool air. Marston followed, standing beside her on the porch. She likes you, he said. I think I like her, Florence replied. She's like a river you don't dare cross too quick. He chuckled. That's her. Florence looked up at the stars. I didn't think I'd have anything like this again. Not just the quiet, the belonging. You do, he said. She turned to face him, and there was no trembling in her voice when she asked, Will you walk with me tomorrow? I'd like to see the far hill. I'll walk anywhere you ask. She nodded, then reached for his hand not out of habit or need, but choice. He laced his fingers through hers and didn't let go. And there, with the night wrapped around them and the earth soft beneath their feet, something settled between them. Not sudden, not loud. Just right. The trail beyond the far hill cut along a stretch of open land where prairie grass whispered against their boots. Florence walked ahead of Marston, her bonnet tied loosely beneath her chin, the ribbon caught sometimes by the breeze. The sun was higher than they'd planned, for it had taken longer than expected to mend the back gate before they could leave, but neither of them mentioned it. At the top of the ridge, Florence stopped. The valley below was quiet, the kind of quiet that held space for breathing. A hawk cut across the sky, its shadow gliding over the rise. Marston came up beside her, his steps even and patient. This where you bring the cattle? she asked. Only in autumn. Grasses too soft now. Hooves sink. She turned to him. Could we build something here? Just small. A bench, maybe? He looked out over the slope. We could. It'd hold up best if we use cedar. Got a few planks in the shed I've been saving. Florence didn't answer right away. She ran her hand across the tall grass, the blade soft between her fingers. I'd sit here often, I think. We can carve the legs together, Marston said. You're steady with a knife. She glanced at him. You noticed that? I notice a lot. They began the walk back slowly, not speaking much, just passing the reins between them when the trail narrowed. Near the base of the hill, Florence paused, her gaze caught by a patch of wild lupin growing in a shaded bend. I haven't seen that color since I left Missouri, she said. You want to take some back? She knelt carefully, choosing stems without root, careful not to strip too many. Just enough to brighten the windowsill. When they reached the cabin, Marston headed to the shed for the cedar. Florence rinsed the dirt from the lupin and set them in a chipped glass jar, placing it near the window above the basin. The flowers leaned toward the light. That evening, they worked side by side in the barn, the scent of sawdust and fresh wood curling through the air. Marston showed her how to sand the edges clean and how to brace the legs with dowels instead of nails. You ever build furniture before? He asked, handing her a rasp. My father had a bench in the yard. I used to sit on it beside him after church. He'd whittle while I read out loud. Marston leaned against the wall, watching her hands move. What did you read? Whatever I could get from the traveling preacher. He left books in exchange for eggs or preserves. He still come around? He passed 2 winters ago. They didn't speak for a while after that. The bench took shape slowly, each part cut and joined with care. When they carried it outside the next morning, the sun caught the grain in the wood, bringing out warm, golden lines. Florence ran her palm along the smooth seat. Feels solid, she said. It is. They loaded it in the wagon and made the trip back to the ridge. At the top, they set it under a knot of trees where the wind didn't cut too sharp. Marston unpacked a folded blanket and laid it across the bench. Florence sat first, her skirts rustling softly. This'll be a good place for remembering, she said. He sat beside her. Or for starting new ones. They didn't speak again for a long while, just watched the light shift across the valley. A pair of deer moved at the edge of the trees, quiet and slow. When they returned home, Florence brought out a tin of dried apples and set them on the table. Marston poured water from the kettle, and they sat across from each other as the day thinned into dusk. You ever think about having more? She asked quietly. Marston lifted his eyes. You mean children? She nodded. He set down his cup. Only if it was with someone who wanted them. Someone who knew what it meant to lose. Florence's hands rested on the table, fingers threaded together. I don't know if I can bear that kind of fear again. But I know the quiet without him is worse. I wouldn't ask for more than you could give, he said. She looked up. But what if I wanted to give it? Someday. His voice gentled. Then I'd be ready. She reached for his hand, not to hold it, but to rest her fingers lightly against his. You've given me space without leaving. You needed it. Still do, maybe. I want to be someone who gives something back. You already are. She blinked against the warmth in her eyes and stood. Come outside with me? They stepped out into the cool dark, where the stars came clear and close. Florence leaned her shoulder against his, and he didn't move, just let her rest there. And when she looked up at him, there was no hesitation in the way she said, You're the first man I've trusted since everything went quiet. He turned toward her slowly. And you're the first thing that's made me believe this land could be more than survival. She lifted her face, and he kissed her not in haste or hunger, but with the steadiness of someone who meant it. When it ended, she didn't pull back. She stayed close, her forehead resting against his. I think I'm ready, she whispered. He nodded. Then we'll build something that holds. The sun rose slow and pale over the Reddick homestead, casting thin lines of light across the cabin floorboards. Florence stood barefoot on the rug by the stove, her hands wrapped around a tin mug still warm from the fire. The morning was quiet, but not empty. It was the kind of quiet that waited patiently like soil waiting for the first green shoot. Marston stepped in from the porch, his boots damp with dew. "Creek's higher than it ought to be," he said, setting his hat on the hook by the door. "Snow melts early this year." Florence nodded, watching steam curl from her mug. "Will it flood?" "No, but it'll pull at the banks. I'll lay stones along the bend today." She set her cup down and reached for the apron draped across the chair. "I'll pack you something to take." He crossed to her, touching her elbow lightly. "You don't have to." "I want to," she said. They didn't say more than that. She wrapped cornbread and dried beef in a cloth, tucking it into the satchel he slung across his shoulder. When he left, she stood at the door longer than usual, watching his figure fade into the shimmering light, the tall grass parting at his knees. Inside, she turned to the shelf where Maribel's Bible sat. Florence had not touched it before. She opened it now, not to read, but to run her fingers across the pressed flower tucked between the pages, a faded violet, delicate and dry. On the inside cover, written in ink gone soft with time, was a name. "Sister, may this hold your steady heart." Florence closed the book gently and returned it to its place. The hours passed with the sound of birdsong and the scrape of broom bristles beneath her feet. She trimmed the candle wicks, folded the linens Maribel had washed before leaving, and carried the last of the dried herbs to the pantry, her palm trailing across the doorframe as she passed. By midday, she'd set a kettle on the stove and stepped outside to check the hens. They clucked low in the heat, feathers fluffed. As she filled the water pan, a shadow moved across the fence line. She turned, squinting. A man on horseback approached slowly. His coat was worn, his eyes sharp beneath the brim of a soiled hat. The gelding beneath him stamped once, restless. "You Mrs. Reddick?" he asked, voice dry as gravel. Florence straightened.
"I'm Florence."
"What's your business?" "Name's Calden Price. Rode in from Sweetwater. Your husband was in town last week. He settled a trade for some timber. Said to deliver news if I passed by." She stepped closer to the fence. "What kind of news?" "Just that the timber's cut and ready. If he wants it hauled, they'll need help loading by Friday." Florence nodded once. "I'll tell him." The man tipped his hat and turned his horse. Florence watched the dust rise behind him as he rode off. She didn't move until the sound of hoofbeats faded. That evening, Marston came back with mud on his sleeves and a branch scraped line across one cheek. "There's a rider," Florence said, as he wiped his boots. "Said your timber's ready." He nodded. "That's sooner than I figured. I'll leave at first light." "I'll come with you." Marston paused. "You sure? I want to learn what keeps this place standing." He studied her face. "We'll leave after breakfast." "It's a long ride." The next morning, they saddled the wagon and set off before the sky had fully brightened. The road to Sweetwater wound through low hills and past cottonwoods, just beginning to leaf out. Florence sat beside him on the bench, a blanket across her lap, the reins loose in his hands. "You ever think about how much of a life is built from pieces?" she asked. He looked over at her. "What kind of pieces?" "Small ones. A bench. A quilt. A day like this." He nodded. "That's where the weight is. In what doesn't shout." They reached the mill near midday. Men loaded the wagon while Marston checked the beams. Florence watched the way he moved, speaking low, always listening. When they were done, the foreman handed her a folded paper. "Your husband said you read," he said. "I've got a daughter that writes me letters. Maybe you'd write her one back. She's 10, wants stories more than facts." Florence took the paper slowly. "I'll try." On the ride home, the The sky turned soft with late sun. Florence unfolded the paper. Blank, but for the child's name. Delia Price. Marston glanced over. That Price's kin? His daughter, Florence said. She wants a story. You'll give her one. I think I will. That night, once the timber was stacked and the lantern lit, Florence sat at the table with a pencil and the paper. Marston carved a strip of cedar by the hearth, the sound of knife against wood a quiet rhythm. "What'll you write?" he asked. She didn't look up. "A girl who plants seeds in cold ground and waits to see what grows." He nodded once. "That's a good place to begin." Florence dipped her head and smiled, not for memory, not for sorrow, but for the life that was quietly taking root beneath her feet. Marston's saw rasped through the final cedar beam as the last of the summer sun spilled across the cabin's west wall. Florence stood just outside, hanging a length of calico across the window, her fingers pinning the corners tight. When she stepped back, the fabric fluttered once, then settled muted red against golden light. "I'd forgotten how much a curtain can change a room," she said. Marston leaned the saw against the porch rail. "You've changed more than the house." She turned toward him, the hem of her apron caught in the breeze. "I've been thinking about that." He waited, not pressing. "In Missouri, I thought the worst thing that could happen was losing someone," she said slowly. "But I was wrong. The worst was thinking I wasn't allowed to go on living after." Marston stepped down into the yard, wiping his hands on a rag. "And now, I'm not surviving anymore," she said. "I'm choosing." He watched her in the quiet that followed, then said, "I've been carving something. Meant to give it to you sooner, but it never felt like the right day." She followed him to the barn, where he reached up to a shelf and pulled down a small, smooth object wrapped in cloth. He handed it to her without a word. Florence unfolded the wrap and let out a soft breath. In her hands lay a wooden bird, small enough to fit in her palm, wings spread mid-glide. The grain ran like wind across its back. "I carved it from a piece of that ridge bench," he said. "So even when you're inside, part of that view stays with you." She looked up at him, her voice quiet. "It's the most beautiful thing anyone's ever given me. I wanted you to have something made just for your hands." Florence held it close, her fingers moving along the delicate lines. "You did." They walked back to the cabin together, the sky folding into dusk. Inside, she placed the bird on the shelf above the basin, where the light would catch its wings each morning. Then, wordlessly, she turned to Marston and took his hand. "I don't want to sleep in the other room anymore," she said. His gaze held hers. "You sure?" "I'm not afraid of the quiet now. Not when you're beside me." He stepped closer, brushing a curl from her cheek. "Florence Whitlow, will you marry me proper?" She didn't hesitate. "Yes." They married 2 Sundays later, beneath the cottonwoods east of the creek, where the ground had dried and the air was still. Maribel returned for the wedding, standing beside Florence as she tied a length of blue ribbon at her wrist. "It's not lace, but it'll hold," she said. "It's perfect," Florence replied. The town preacher came out from 3 Cedars, a man with a thin voice and a kind face. Marston wore his best shirt, sleeves pressed sharp as fence rails. Florence wore a dress she'd sewn from muslin and lavender thread. They spoke their vows with clear voices, Marston's thumb resting gently at her wrist the whole way through. Afterward, the guests shared bread and cider beneath the open sky. The chickens wandered between the chairs, and someone brought out a fiddle. Florence danced once, barefoot in the grass, her hand warm in Marston's. Later, after the guests had gone and the light had thinned to silver, Marston led her to the ridge. The bench waited there, worn smooth from weeks of sitting. They sat in the hush, their shoulders touching, the valley stretching wide below. "You think we'll have children?" she asked. "If we're meant to," he said. "But I'll be content either way." "I think I'd like to try," she whispered. He took her hand gently. "Then we will." They sat a while longer, until the stars came out and the wind settled around them like a quilt. In the years that followed, the cabin grew. Marston added a loft and a second window in the kitchen. Florence taught herself to write short stories, sending them to Delia Price, who wrote back with news of her chickens and schoolyard mischief. They had one child, a girl with Marston's quiet eyes and Florence's steady hands. They named her Eleanor, after no one in particular, just because it felt like a name that would carry. Maribel visited every spring, bringing fabric and opinions. She never stayed more than a fortnight, but always left behind something stitched or sweet. And the ridge? They never stopped walking there. The bench aged, but they kept it mended, adding new cedar slats as the old ones wore soft. Florence never forgot Missouri. She never forgot the ache of loss. But she no longer lived in that shadow. She lived in a house with sunlight through the calico, in a home where laughter rose like bread in the oven. She lived with a man who saw her fully and loved her wholly. And each day, as the wind moved through the lupin and the creek bent around its stones, she rose with him and chose that life again and again.